when in the enjoyment of his power, he never would permit anyone to reply to the attacks that were made upon him. Whatever pains might have been bestowed on such answers, said he, they would only have given additional weight to the accusations they were intended to refute. It would have been said that all that was written in my defence was ordered and paid for. The ill-managed praise of those by whom I was surrounded had already in some instances been more prejudicial to me than all the abuse of which I was the object. Facts were the most convincing answers. A fine monument, another good law, or a new triumph were sufficient to defeat thousands of such falsehoods. Declamation passes away, but deeds remain. This is unquestionably true with regard to posterity. The great men of former times are handed down to us free from the ephemeral accusations of their contemporaries. But it is not thus during the lifetime of the individual, and in 1814 Napoleon was convinced by cruel experience that even deeds may vanish before the fury of declamation. The moment of his fall, he was absolutely overwhelmed by a torrent of abuse. But it was reserved for him whose life had been so fertile in prodigies to surmount this adverse stroke of fate, and almost immediately to arise resplendent from amidst his own ruins. His miraculous return is certainly unparalleled, both in its execution or its results. The transports which it called forth penetrated into neighbouring countries, where prayers for his success were offered up, either publicly or in secret, and he who, in 1814, was defeated and pursued as the scourge of human nature, suddenly reappeared in 1815 as the hope of his fellow creatures. Calumny and falsehood, in this instance, lost their prey by having overshot their mark. The good sense of mankind in a great measure rendered justice to Napoleon, and the abuse that had been heaped upon him was thenceforth discredited. Poison lost its effect on Mithridates, said the emperor, as he was the other day glancing over some new libels upon himself, and since 1814 calumny cannot injure me. In the universal clamour which was directed against him when in the enjoyment of his power, England bore the most conspicuous part. In England, two great machines were mentioned in full activity, the one conducted by the emigrants, for whom nothing was too bad, and the other under the control of the English ministers, who had established a system of defamation and who had regularly organised its action and effects. They maintained in their pay pamphleteers and libellists their tasks were marked out to them, and their plans of attack were regularly laid and combined. The English ministry multiplied the employment of these potent engines in England more than elsewhere. The English, who were more free and enlightened than other nations, stood the more in need of excitement. From this system, the English ministers derived the twofold advantage of rousing public opinion against the common enemy, and withdrawing attention from their own conduct by directing popular clamour and indignation to the character and conduct of others. By this means, their own character and conduct were screened from that investigation and recrimination which they might not have found very agreeable. Thus, the assassination of Paul at St. Petersburg and of our envoys in Persia, the seizure of Nepatandi in the free city of Hamburg, the capture, in time of peace, of two rich Spanish frigates, the acquisition of the whole of India, the retaining of Malta and the Cape of Good Hope, against the faith of treaties, the Machiavellian rupture of the Treaty of Amiens, the unjust seizure of our ships previously to a new declaration of war, the Danish fleet seized with such cold and ironical perfidy, all these aggressions were overlooked in the general agitation which had been artfully stirred up against a foreign power. In order to take a just view of the accusations which have been heaped upon Napoleon by the numerous publications written against him, it is necessary to make allowance for passions and circumstances, to reject with contempt all that is apocryphal, anonymous, and purely declamatory, and to adhere solely to the facts and proofs which would doubtless have been produced by those who, after the overthrow of their enemy, became possessed of the authentic documents, the archives of the public departments and courts of law, in short, of all the sources of truth which are usually to be found in society. But nothing has been published, nothing has been brought forward, and, therefore, how much of this monstrous scaffolding falls to the ground. And to be still more rigidly equitable, if we wish to judge Napoleon by the example of his peers or great men in analogous circumstances, that is to say, by comparing him with the founders of dynasties or those who have ascended thrones by dint of popular commotions, it may then confidently be said that he is unequalled, and that he shines purely from amidst all that is opposed to him. It would be a loss of time to cite the numberless examples furnished by ancient and modern history. They are accessible to everyone. It is only necessary to refer to the two countries which are here under consideration. Did Napoleon, like Hugues Capet, raise his arm against his sovereign? Did he cause him to perish in captivity? Has Napoleon acted like the princes of the present House of Brunswick, who in 1715 and 1745 loaded the Seafowl with victims to whom the present English ministers, through their inconsequential policy and the principles they now profess, leave no other qualification than that of faithful subjects dying for their lawful sovereign? The course by which Napoleon advanced to supreme power is perfectly simple and natural. It is single in history. The very circumstances of his elevation render it unparalleled. "I have not usurped the crown," said he one day to the Council of State. "I have raised it out of the mire. The people placed it on my head. Let their acts be respected." By thus raising up the crown, Napoleon restored France to her rank in European society, terminated her horrors, and revived her character. He freed us of all the evils of our fatal crisis, and reserved to us all the advantages arising out of it. "I ascended the throne unsullied by any of the crimes of my situation," said he on one occasion. How few founders of dynasties can say as much. Never during any period of our history were favours distributed with so much impartiality, merit so indiscriminately sought out and rewarded, public money so usefully employed, the arts and sciences better encouraged, or the glory and lustre of the country raised to so high a pitch. "It is my wish," said he one day to the Council of State, "that the title of Frenchman should be the best and most desirable on earth, that a Frenchman travelling through any part of Europe may think and find himself at home. If liberty seemed occasionally to suffer encroachments, if authority seemed sometimes to overstep its limits, circumstances rendered those measures necessary and inevitable. Our present misfortunes have, though too late, made us sensible of this truth. We now render justice, though also too late, to the courage, judgment, and foresight which then dictated those steps. It is certain that in this respect, the political fall of Napoleon has considerably increased his influence. Who can now doubt that his glory and the lustre of his character have been infinitely augmented by his misfortune? If the works which have fallen in my way should present any circumstances connected with these general considerations, they will be the object of my particular attention. I do not intend to enter upon a political controversy. I shall not address myself to party men, whose opinions are founded on their interests and passions. I speak only to the cool friend of truth, or to the unprejudiced writer, who in future times may impartially seek for materials. To them alone I address myself. In their eyes, my testimony will be superior to anonymous evidence, and will rank on an equality with that which bears a creditable character. The first work that I looked into was the Anti-Gallican, of which I shall speak hereafter. Employment of our time, 19th 22nd. We continued our course with the same wind, the same sky, and the same temperature. Our voyage was monotonous but pleasant. Our days were long, but employment helped them to glide away. The Emperor now began regularly to dictate to me his campaigns in Italy. I had already written several chapters. For the first few days, the Emperor viewed this occupation with indifference, but the regularity and promptitude with which I presented to him my daily task, together with the progress we made, soon excited his interest, and at length the pleasure he derived from this dictation rendered it absolutely necessary to him. He was sure to send for me about 11 o'clock every morning, and he seemed himself to await the hour with impatience. I always read to him what he had dictated on the preceding day, and he then made corrections and dictated farther. In this way the time passed rapidly till 4 o'clock arrived, when he summoned his valet de chambre. He then proceeded to the state cabin, and passed the time until dinner in playing at piquet or chess. The Emperor dictates very rapidly, almost as fast as he speaks in ordinary conversation. I was, therefore, obliged to invent a kind of hieroglyphic writing, and I, in my turn, dictated to my son. I was happy enough to be able to collect almost literally every sentence that fell from him. I had now not a moment to spare. At dinner time, somebody was sure to come and tell me that all the company were seated at table. Fortunately, my seat was near the door, which always stood open. I had some time since changed my place at the request of Captain Ross, the commander of the vessel, who, as he did not speak French, took the opportunity of occasionally asking me the meaning of words. I therefore took my seat between him and the Grand Marshal. Captain Ross was a man of agreeable manners, and was exceedingly kind and attentive to us. I had learnt, according to the English custom, to invite him to take a glass of wine, drinking mine to the health of his wife, and he would then drink to the health of mine. This was our daily practice. After dinner, the Emperor never failed to allude to his morning dictation, as if pleased with the occupation and amusement it had afforded him. On these occasions, as well as whenever I happened to meet him in the course of the day, he would address me in a jocular tone with, "Ah, sage Las Cases, illustrious memorialist, the Sa Helena," and other similar expressions. Then he would frequently add, "My dear Las Cases, these memoirs will be as celebrated as any that have preceded them. You will survive as long as any previous memoir writer. It will be impossible to dwell upon the great events of our time, or to write about me without referring to you." Then, resuming his pleasantry, he would add, "After all, it will be said, he must have known Napoleon well. He was his councillor of state, his chamberlain, his faithful companion. We cannot help believing him, for he was an honest man and incapable of misrepresentation." 23rd, 25th. The west wind still continued, to our great astonishment. It was a sort of phenomenon in these regions, and had hitherto been very much in our favour. But with regard to phenomena, chance produced one of a much more extraordinary kind on the 23rd, when we crossed the line in augury latitude, augury longitude, and augury declination. This is a circumstance which chance alone may perhaps renew only once in a century, since it is necessary to arrive precisely at the first meridian about noon, in order to pass the line at that same hour, or to arrive there at the same time with the sun. This was a day of great merriment and disorder among the crew. It was the ceremony which the English sailors call the christening. The sailors dress themselves up in the most grotesque way. One is disguised as Neptune, and all persons on board the ship who have not previously crossed the line are formally presented to him. An immense razor is passed over their chins with a lather made of pitch. Buckets of water are thrown over them, and the loud bursts of laughter which accompany their retreat complete their initiation into the grand mystery. No one is spared, and the officers are generally more roughly used than the lowest of the sailors. The admiral, who had previously amused himself by endeavouring to alarm us with the anticipation of this awful ceremony, now very courteously exempted us from the inconvenience and ridicule attending it. We were with every mark of attention and respect presented to the rude god, who paid to each of us a compliment after his own fashion, and thus our trial ended. The emperor was scrupulously respected during the whole of this Saturnalian festivity, when respect is usually shewn to no one. On being informed of the decorum which had been observed with respect to him, he ordered 100 Napoleons to be distributed to the grotesque Neptune and his crew, which the admiral opposed, perhaps from motives of prudence as well as politeness. Examination of the Anti-Gallican, Sir Robert Wilson's writings, Plague at Jaffa, Anecdotes of the French army in Egypt, Feelings of the army in the Egyptian campaign, Berthier, Jests of the soldiery, Dromedaries, Death of Kleber, The young Arab, Singular coincidences respecting Filippo and Napoleon, Circumstances on which fate depends, Caffarelli's attachment to Napoleon, Reputation of the French army in the East, Napoleon quitting Egypt to assume the government of France, The English expedition, Kleber and Desaic. 26th to 30th. The weather still continued favourable. Having passed the line, we momentarily expected to fall in with an east or southeast wind. The continuance of the west wind was extraordinary, and it was impossible it could last much longer. The resolution which the admiral had adopted of bearing considerably to the east rendered our situation very favourable, and we had every reason to hope for a short passage. One afternoon, the sailors caught an enormous shark. The emperor inquired the cause of the great noise and confusion which he suddenly heard overhead. Being informed of what had occurred, he expressed a wish to have a sight of the sea monster. He accordingly went up to the poop, and incautiously approached too near the animal, which by a sudden movement knocked down 4 or 5 of the sailors, and had well nigh broke the emperor's legs. He descended the larboard gangway, covered with blood. We thought he was severely hurt, but it proved to be only the blood of the shark. My labours advanced with the greatest regularity. The Anti-Gallican, which was the first work I undertook to read, was a volume of 500 pages, comprising all that had been written in England at the time when that country was menaced with the French invasion. It was the object of the English government to nationalise opposition to that event, and to rouse the whole nation against her dangerous enemy. The book contained a collection of public speeches, exhortations, patriotic appeals of zealous citizens, satirical songs, sarcastic productions, and highly coloured newspaper articles, all pouring a torrent of odium and ridicule upon the French and their first consul, whose courage, genius, and power excited the greatest alarm. This was all perfectly natural and allowable. Productions of this sort are like a shower of arrows thrown by combatants before they come to a close action. Some hit, and some are carried away by the wind. Such writings will never afford satisfactory evidence to a man of judgment, and they scarcely merit contradiction. Pamphleteers are little regarded, because their character is the antidote of their poison. It is not so with the historian. The latter, however, degrades himself to a level with the pamphlet writer, when he departs from the calm dignity and impartiality required for his office, to indulge in declamation and to steep his pen in gall. With these feelings I arose from the perusal of the different productions of Sir Robert Wilson, which I read after the Anti-Gallican. This writer did us the greater injury, because his talents, his courage, and his numerous and brilliant services gave him importance in the eyes of his countrymen. A circumstance which I am about to state caused the writings of Sir R. Wilson to be particularly known and spoken of on board the ship. Sir Robert had a son among the young midshipmen on board the Northumberland, and my son, whose similarity of age occasioned him to be much in the society of these youths, could easily observe the change which took place in their opinions with respect to us. They were at first very much prejudiced against us. When the Emperor came on board, they regarded him as an ogre ready to devour them. But on a better acquaintance with us, truth soon exercised over them the same influence which it produced on the rest of the crew. This was, however, at the expense of young Wilson, who was scouted by his companions, by way of expiation for the stories which his father had circulated. At this part of the manuscript a great number of leaves are struck out. The reason was explained on the margin as follows. I had collected numerous offensive statements from the writings of Sir Robert Wilson, to which I had perhaps replied with too much bitterness. A recent circumstance has induced me to suppress this portion of my journal. Sir Robert Wilson has lately acted a conspicuous part in a cause which does honour to the hearts of all who were concerned in it. I allude to the saving of La Valette. Being asked before a French tribunal whether he had not formerly published works respecting our affairs, he replied in the affirmative, and added that he had stated in them what he then believed to be true. These words are more to the purpose than anything I could say, and I therefore hasten to cancel what I have already written, happy in thus having an opportunity to render justice to Sir Robert Wilson, on whose sincerity and good intentions I had, in my indignation, cast reflections. I therefore set aside the works of Sir Robert Wilson, and the various accusations contained in them. I also suppress the numerous refutations I had collected. I shall merely stop to consider one circumstance which has been repeated in 100 different works, the report of which has been circulated through Europe and has obtained credit even in France. I allude to the poisoning of the men infected with the plague at Jaffa. Certainly nothing can better prove how easily calumny may affect its object. If the voice of slander be bold and powerful, and can command numerous echoes, no matter how far probability, reason, common sense, and truth be violated, the wished-for end is sure to be attained. A general, a hero, a great man, hitherto respected by fortune as well as by mankind, at that moment riveting the attention of 3/4 of the globe, commanding admiration even from his enemies, was suddenly accused of a crime declared to be unheard of and unparalleled, of an act pronounced to be inhuman, atrocious, and cruel, and what is above all extraordinary, he could have no possible object in committing that crime. The most absurd details, the most improbable circumstances, the most ridiculous episodes were invented to give a colouring to this first falsehood. The story was circulated through Europe, malevolence seized it and exaggerated its enormity. It was published in every newspaper, recorded in every book, and thenceforward was looked upon as an established fact. Indignation was at its height and clamour universal. It would have been vain to reason or attempt to stem the torrent, or to show that no proofs of the fact had been adduced, and that the story contradicted itself. It would have been vain to bring forward opposite and incontrovertible evidence, the evidence of those very medical men who were said to have administered, or to have refused to administer, the poison. It would have been vain to expose the unreasonableness of accusing of inhumanity the man who, but a short time before, had immortalized the hospitals of Jaffa by an act of the sublimest heroism, risking his own safety by solemnly touching the troops infected with the plague, to deceive and soothe the imaginations of the sick men. In vain might it have been urged that the idea of such a crime could not be affixed on him, who, when consulted by the medical officers as to the expediency of burning or merely washing the clothes worn by the invalids, and being reminded of the enormous loss attendant on the former measure, replied, "Gentlemen, I came here to fix the attention and to recall the interests of Europe to the centre of the ancient world, and not with the view of amassing wealth." In vain would it have been shown that there could be no object, no motive whatever for this supposed crime. Had the French general any reason to suspect a design for corrupting his invalids and converting them into reinforcements against himself? Did he hope that this barbarous act would completely rid him of the infection? He might have effected that object equally well by leaving his invalids to be overtaken by the enemy's troops, which would moreover have been the means of spreading the contagion among the latter. It would have been vain to show that an unfeeling and selfish chief might have freed himself from all embarrassment by merely leaving the unfortunate men behind him. They would have been massacred, it is true, but no one would ever have thought of addressing a reproach to him. These and every other argument would have been vain and useless, so powerful and infallible are the effects of falsehood and declamation when the passions of mankind are interested in their propagation. The imaginary crime was repeated by every mouth, was engraved on every heart, and to the common mass of mankind it will perhaps forever continue a positive and incontrovertible fact. A circumstance which will not a little surprise those who have yet to learn how little credit is due to public report, and which will also serve to show the errors that may creep into history, is that Marshal Bertrand, who was himself with the army in Egypt, though certainly in a rank which did not enable him to come into immediate contact with the general-in-chief, firmly believed, up to the period of his residence at St. Helena, the story of poison having been administered to 60 invalids. The report was circulated and believed even in our army. Therefore, what answer could be given to those who triumphantly asserted, "It is a fact, I assure you. I have it from officers who served in the French army at the time"? Nevertheless, the whole story is false. I have collected the following facts from the highest source, from the mouth of Napoleon himself. First, that the invalids in question who were infected with the plague amounted, according to the report made to the General-in-Chief, only to 7 in number. Second, that it was not the General-in-Chief but a professional man, who at the moment of the crisis proposed the administering of opium. Third, that the opium was not administered to a single individual. Fourth, that the retreat having been effected slowly, a rear guard was left behind in Jaffa for 3 days. Fifth, that on the departure of the rearguard, the invalids were all dead, except 1 or 2, who must have fallen into the hands of the English. Since my return to Paris, having had opportunities of conversing with those whose situation and profession naturally rendered them the first actors in the scene, those whose testimony must be considered as official and authentic, I have had the curiosity to inquire into the most minute details, and the following is the result of my inquiries. The invalids under the care of the surgeon-in-chief, that is to say, the wounded, were all, without exception, removed with the help of the horses belonging to the staff, not excepting even those of the General-in-Chief, who proceeded for a considerable distance on foot, like the rest of the army. These, therefore, are quite out of the question. With regard to the rest of the invalids, about 20 in number, who were under the care of the physician-in-chief, and who were in an absolutely desperate condition, totally unfit to be removed, while the enemy was advancing, it is very true that Napoleon asked the physician-in-chief whether it would not be an act of humanity to administer opium to them. It is also true that the physician replied, his business was to cure and not to kill, an answer which, as it seems to have reference to an order rather than to a subject of discussion, has, perhaps, furnished a basis on which slander and falsehood might invent and propagate the fabrication which has since been circulated on this subject. Finally, the details which I have been able to collect afford me the following incontestable results. First, that no order was given for the administration of opium to the sick. 2. C. 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 In the medicine chest of the army, a single grain of opium for the use of the sick. Third, that even had the order been given, and had there been a supply of opium, temporary and local circumstances, which it would be tedious to enumerate, the following circumstances have probably helped to occasion, and may, perhaps, in some degree excuse, the mistake of those who have obstinately maintained the truth of the contrary facts. Some of our wounded men, who had been put on board ship, fell into the hands of the English. We had been short of medicines of all kinds in the camp, and we had supplied the deficiency by compositions formed from indigenous trees and plants. The ptisans and other medicines had a horrible taste and appearance. The prisoners, either for the purpose of exciting pity or from having heard of the opium story, which the nature of the medicines might incline them to believe, told the English that they had miraculously escaped death, having had poison administered to them by their medical officers. So much for the invalids under the care of the surgeon-in-chief. Now for the others. The army unfortunately had, as apothecary-in-chief, a wretch who had been allowed the use of 5 camels to convey from Cairo the quantity of medicines necessary for the expedition. This man was base enough to supply himself on his own account, instead of medicines, with sugar, coffee, wine, and other provisions, which he afterwards sold at an enormous profit. On the discovery of the fraud, the indignation of the general-in-chief was without bounds, and the offender was condemned to be shot. But all the medical officers, who were so distinguished for their courage, and whose attentive care had rendered them so dear to the army, implored his pardon, alleging that the honour of the whole body would be compromised by his punishment, and thus the culprit escaped. Some time after, when the English took possession of Cairo, this man joined them and made common cause with them. But, having attempted to renew some of his old offences, he was condemned to be hanged, and again escaped by slandering the general-in-chief, Bonaparte, of whom he invented a multitude of horrible stories, and by representing himself as the identical person who had, by the general's orders, administered opium to the soldiers infected with the plague. His pardon was the condition and the reward of his calumnies. This was doubtless the first source whence the story was derived, by those who were not induced to propagate it from malevolent motives. Time has, however, fully exposed this absurd calumny, as well as many others which have been applied in the same direction, and that with so great a rapidity, that on revising my manuscript, I have been surprised at the importance I have attached to the refutation of a charge which no one would now dare to maintain. Still, I thought it best to preserve what I had written as a testimony of the impression of the moment, and if I have now added some farther details, it is because they happened to lie within my reach, and I thought it important to record them as historical facts. Sir Robert Wilson has, in his work, boasted with seeming complacency of having been the first to make known and to propagate these odious charges in Europe. His countryman, Sir Sidney Smith, may perhaps dispute this honour with him, particularly as he may, in a great measure at least, justly lay claim to the merit of their invention. To him, and to the system of corruption he encouraged, Europe is indebted for all the false reports with which she has been inundated, to the great detriment of our brave army of Egypt. It is well known that Sir Sidney Smith did everything in his power to corrupt our army. The false intelligence from Europe, the slander of the general-in-chief, the powerful bribes held out to the officers and soldiers were all approved by him. The documents are published, his proclamations are known. At one time they created sufficient alarm in the French general to induce him to seek to put a stop to them, which he did by forbidding all communication with the English and stating in the order of the day that their commodore had gone mad. This assertion was believed in the French army, and it so much enraged Sir Sidney Smith that he sent Napoleon a challenge. The general replied that he had business of too great importance on his hands to think of troubling himself about such a trifle, had he received a challenge from the great Marlborough. Then indeed he might have thought it worth while to consider of it. But if the English seaman really felt inclined to amuse himself at a tilting match, he would send him a tall, bullying grenadier, and neutralize a few yards of the sea-coast, where the mad commodore might come ashore and enjoy his heart's content of it. As I am on the subject of Egypt, I will here note down all the information I collected in my detached conversations, and which may possibly not be found in the campaign of Egypt dictated by Napoleon to the Grand Marshal. The campaign of Italy exhibits all the most brilliant and decisive results to which military genius and conception ever gave birth. Diplomatic views, administrative talents, legislative measures, are they uniformly blended in harmony with the prodigies of war. But the most striking and the finishing touch in the picture is the sudden and irresistible ascendancy which the young general acquired. The anarchy of equality, the jealousy of republican principles, everything vanished before him. There was not a power, even to the ridiculous sovereignty of the Directory, which was not immediately suspended. The Directory required no accounts from the General-in-Chief of the Army of Italy. It was left to himself to send them. No plan, no system was prescribed to him. But accounts of victories and conclusions of armistices, of the destruction of old states and the creation of new ones, were constantly received from him. In the expedition of Egypt may be retraced all that is admired in the campaign of Italy. The reflecting observer will even perceive that in the Egyptian expedition the points of resemblance are of a more important nature, from the difficulties of every kind which gave character to the campaign, and required greater genius and resources on the part of its conductor. In Egypt, a new order of things appeared. Climate, country, inhabitants, religion, manners, and mode of fighting, all were different. The memoirs of the campaign of Egypt will determine points which at the time formed only the subjects of conjecture and discussion to a large portion of society. First, the expedition of Egypt was undertaken at the earnest and mutual desire of the Directory and the General-in-Chief. Taking of Malta was not the consequence of a private understanding, but of the wisdom of the General-in-Chief. "It was in Mantua that I took Malta," said the Emperor one day. "It was the generous treatment observed towards Wormser that secured to me the submission of the Grand Master and his knights." Third, the conquest of Egypt was calculated with as much judgment as it was executed with skill. If Saint-Jean d'Acre had surrendered to the French army, a great revolution would have taken place in the East. The General-in-Chief would have established an empire there, and the destinies of France would have taken a different turn. Fourth, on its return from the campaign of Syria, the French army had scarcely sustained any loss. It remained in the most formidable and prosperous condition. Fifth, the departure of the General-in-Chief for France was the result of a grand and magnanimous plan. How ridiculous is the imbecility of those who consider that departure as an evasion or a desertion. Sixth, Kleber fell a victim to Mussulmanic fanaticism. There is not the slightest foundation for the absurd calumny which would have attributed this catastrophe to the policy of his predecessor or to the intrigues of his successor. Seventh, and lastly, it is pretty well proved that Egypt would have remained forever a French province if any other but Menou had been appointed for her defence. Nothing but the gross errors of that general could have lost us the possession of Egypt. The Emperor said that no army in the world was less fit for the Egyptian expedition than that which he led there, the army of Italy. It would be difficult to describe the disgust, the discontent, the melancholy, the despair of that army on its first arrival in Egypt. The Emperor himself saw 2 dragoons run out of the ranks and throw themselves into the Nile. Bertrand had seen the most distinguished generals, such as Lannes and Murat, in momentary fits of rage, throw their laced hats on the sand and trample on them in the presence of the soldiers. The Emperor explained these feelings surprisingly well. This army, said he, had fulfilled its career. All the individuals belonging to it were satiated with wealth, rank, pleasure, and consideration. They were not fit for the deserts and the fatigues of Egypt. And, continued he, had that army been placed in other hands than mine, it is difficult to say what excesses might not have been committed. More than one conspiracy was formed to carry away the flags to Alexandria, and other things of the same sort. The influence, the character, and the glory of the general could alone restrain the troops. One day Napoleon, losing his temper in his turn, rushed among a group of discontented generals, and addressing himself to the tallest, "You have held mutinous language," said he with vehemence. "Take care that I do not fulfill my duty. Your 5'10" should not save you from being shot in a couple of hours." With regard, however, to their conduct before the enemy, the Emperor said that this army never ceased to be the army of Italy, that it still preserved the same admirable character. The most difficult party to manage was that which the Emperor used to call the faction of the sentimentalists, whom it was impossible to keep under any restraint. Their minds were diseased. They spent the night in gazing on the moon for the reflected image of the idols they had left in Europe. At the head of this party was Berthier, the weak and spiritless Berthier, who, when the General-in-Chief was preparing to sail from Toulon, posted night and day from Paris to tell him that he was unwell and could not follow him, though he was the head of the staff. The general-in-chief took not the smallest notice of what he said, and Berthier, finding himself no longer at the feet of the fair one who had dispatched him with the excuse, set sail along with him. On his arrival in Egypt he became a prey to ennui, and was unable to subdue his tender recollections. He solicited and obtained permission to return to France. He took leave of Napoleon, and bade him a formal adieu, but shortly returned again with his eyes full of tears, saying that he would not, after all, dishonour himself, and that he could not separate his destiny from that of his general. Berthier's love was mingled with a kind of worship. Adjoining the tent destined for his own use, he always had another prepared, and furnished with the magnificence of the most elegant boudoir. This was consecrated to the portrait of his mistress, before which he would sometimes even go so far as to burn incense. This tent was pitched even in the deserts of Syria. Napoleon said with a smile that his temple had oftener than once been profaned by a worship less pure, through the clandestine introduction of foreign divinities. Berthier never relinquished his passion, which sometimes carried him to the very verge of idiocy. In his first account of the Battle of Marengo, young Visconti, whose highest rank was that of a captain, was mentioned 5 or 6 times in remembrance of his mother. One would have thought, said Napoleon, that the youth had gained the battle. Surely the general-in-chief must have been ready to throw the paper in the writer's face. The emperor calculated that he had given Berthier 40 millions during his life, but he supposed that from this weakness of his mind, his want of regularity, and his ridiculous passion, he had squandered away a great part of it. The discontent of the troops in Egypt happily vented itself in sarcastic jokes. This is the humour which always bears a Frenchman through difficulties. They had a great spite at General Caffarelli, whom they believed to have been one of the promoters of the expedition. Caffarelli had a wooden leg, having lost one of his limbs on the banks of the Rhine, and whenever the soldiers saw him hobbling past, they would say, loud enough for him to hear, "That fellow does not care what happens. He is certain, at all events, to have one leg in France." The men of science who accompanied the expedition also came in for their share of the jests. Assays were very numerous in Egypt. Almost all the soldiers possessed 1 or 2, and they used always to call them their demi-savants. The general-in-chief, on his departure from France, had issued a proclamation in which he informed the troops that he was about to take them to a country where he would make them all rich, where they should each have 7 acres of land at their disposal. The soldiers, when they found themselves in the midst of the desert, surrounded by the boundless ocean of sand, began to question the generosity of their general. They thought he had observed singular moderation in having promised only 7 acres. "The rogue," said they, "might with safety make us a more unlimited offer. We should not abuse his good nature." While the army was passing through Syria, there was not a soldier but was heard to repeat these lines from Zaïre. "Les Français sont lassés des chercheurs de son maillis, des climats qui pour eux, eux le destin n'a point fait, ils n'abandonnent point leur fertile patrie, pour l'envoyer aux déserts de l'Aride d'Arabie." On one occasion, the general-in-chief, having a few moments of leisure to look about the country, took advantage of the ebb tide, and crossed on foot to the opposite coast of the Red Sea. Night surprised him on his return, and he lost his way in the midst of the rising tide. He was in the greatest danger, and very narrowly escaped perishing precisely in the same manner as Pharaoh. "This," said Napoleon, "would have furnished all the preachers of Christianity with a splendid text against me." On reaching the Arabian coast of the Red Sea, he received a deputation of the Cenobites of Mount Sinai, who came to implore his protection, and to request him to inscribe his name on the ancient register of their charters. Napoleon inscribed his name on the same list with those of Ali, Saladin, Abraham, and others. In allusion to this circumstance, or something of a similar kind, the emperor observed that he had in the course of 1 year received letters from Rome and Mecca, the Pope addressing him as his dearest son, and the sheriff styling him the protector of the Holy Kaaba. This singular coincidence, however, is scarcely surprising, with reference to him who has led armies both through the burning sands of the tropic and over the frozen steppes of the north, who, while he narrowly escaped being swallowed up in the waves of the Red Sea, and might have perished in the flames of Moscow, threatened the Indies from those 2 extreme points. The general-in-chief shared the fatigues of the soldiers. The privations endured by every individual in the army were sometimes so great that they were compelled to dispute with each other for the smallest enjoyments, without the least distinction of rank. To such extremities were they reduced, that in the desert the soldiers would hardly relinquish their places to allow the general to dip his hands in the muddy stream. On one occasion, as they were passing by the ruins of Pelusium, and were almost suffocated with the heat, someone resigned to him the fragment of an ancient door, beneath which he contrived to shade his head for a few minutes. And this, said Napoleon, was no trifling concession. It was on this very spot, while removing some stones at his feet, that chance rendered him the possessor of a superb antique well known in the learned world. In proceeding to Asia, the French army had to cross the desert which separates that continent from Africa. Kebir, who commanded the advance guard, mistook his road and lost his way in the desert. Napoleon, who was following at the distance of half a day's march, attended by a slender escort, found himself at night. For in the midst of the Turkish camp, he was closely pursued, and escaped only because, it being night, the Turks suspected an ambush was intended. The next source of uneasiness was the doubtful fate of Kebir and his detachment, and the greater part of the night was passed in the most cruel anxiety. At length they got information respecting them from some Arabs of the deserts, and the general-in-chief hastened on his dromedary in quest of his troops. He found them overwhelmed with despair, and ready to perish from thirst and fatigue. Some of the young soldiers had, in a moment of frenzy, even broken their muskets. The sight of their general seemed to give them new life by reviving their hopes. Napoleon informed them that a supply of provisions and water was coming up behind him. But, said he to the troops, if relief had been longer delayed, would that have excused your murmuring and loss of courage? No, soldiers, learn to die with honor. Napoleon travelled the greater part of the way through the desert on a dromedary. The physical hardihood of this animal renders it unnecessary to pay the least attention to his sustenance. He scarcely eats or drinks, but his moral sensibility is extreme. Harsh treatment provokes his resentment and renders him furious. The emperor observed that the roughness of his trot created nausea, like the motion of a ship. The animal will travel 20 leagues. The emperor formed some dromedary regiments, and the use he made of them in the army soon proved the destruction of the Arabs. The rider squats himself on the back of the animal, through whose nostrils a ring is passed, which serves to guide him. He is very obedient, and on a certain signal made by the voice of the rider, the animal kneels down to allow him to alight. The dromedary will carry very heavy burdens, and he is never unloaded during the whole of the journey. On his arrival at evening stations, his load is propped up, and the animal lies down and goes to sleep. At daybreak he rises. His burden is on his back, and he is ready to continue his journey. The dromedary is only a beast of burden, and not at all fit for draught. In Syria, however, they succeeded in yoking them to field pieces, and thus rendering them essentially serviceable. Napoleon became very popular among the Egyptians, who gave him the name of Sultan Kebir, Father of the Fire. He inspired particular respect. Wherever he appeared, the people rose in his presence, and this deference was paid to him alone. The uniform consideration with which he treated the sheikhs, and the adroitness by which he gained their confidence, rendered him truly the sovereign of Egypt, and more than once saved his life. But for the connection he maintained with the Egyptians, he would have fallen a victim to fanaticism, like Kebir, who, on the contrary, rendered himself odious to the sheikhs, and perished in consequence of subjecting one of them to the punishment of the bastinado. Bertrand was one of the judges who condemned the assassin, and on his telling us this fact one day at dinner, the emperor observed, "If slanderers, who accuse me of having caused the death of Kebir, were acquainted with the fact you have mentioned, they would not hesitate to call you the assassin or the accomplice, and would take it for granted that your title of Grand Marshal and your residence at St. Helena are the reward and the punishment of the crime." Napoleon willingly conversed with the people of the country, and always revealed sentiments of justice which struck them with wonder. On his way back to Syria, an Arab tribe came to meet him, for the double purpose of showing him respect and of selling their services as guides. The chief of the tribe was unwell, and his place was filled by his son, a youth of the age and make of your boy here, said the emperor to me. He was mounted on his dromedary, riding close beside me and chatting to me with great familiarity. "Sultan Kebir," said he, "I could give you good advice now that you are returning to Cairo. Well, speak, my friend, and if your advice is good, I will follow it. I'll tell you what I would do if I were in your place. As soon as I got to Cairo, I would order the richest slave merchant into the market, and I would choose 20 of the prettiest women for myself. I would next send for the richest jewelers, and would make them give up a good share of their stock. I would then do the same with all the other merchants, for what is the use of reigning or being powerful, if not to acquire riches? But, my friend, suppose it were more noble to preserve them for others. This sentiment seemed to make him reflect a little, without convincing him. The young man was evidently very promising. For an Arab, he was lively and courageous, and led his troop with dignity and order. He is perhaps destined one day or other to carry his advice into execution in the marketplace of Cairo. On another occasion, some Arabs who were on friendly terms with the army penetrated into a village on the frontier, and an unfortunate fellah peasant was killed. The Sultan Kebir flew into a great passion, and vowing that he would have vengeance, gave orders that the tribe should be pursued into the desert to extinction. This order was given in the presence of the Grand Sheiks, one of whom could not refrain from laughing at his anger and his determination. "Sultan Kebir," said he, "you are playing a bad game just now. Do not quarrel with these people. They can do you 10 times more harm than you can do them. And besides, what is it all about? Because they have killed a miserable peasant. Was he your cousin, a proverbial expression among them?" "He was more than my cousin," replied Napoleon. "All those whom I govern are my children. Power is given to me only that I may ensure their safety." On hearing these words, all the sheiks bowed their heads and said, "Oh, that is very fine. You have spoken like the Prophet." The decision of the Grand Mosque of Cairo in favor of the French army was a masterpiece of skill on the part of the General-in-Chief, who induced the Synod of the Grand Sheiks to declare, by a public act, that the Mussulmans should obey and pay tribute to the French general. It is the first and only example of the sort since the establishment of the Koran, which forbids submission to infidels. The details of this transaction are invaluable. They will be found in the campaigns of Egypt. St. Jean d'Arc doubtless presented a singular spectacle when 2 European armies met with hostile intentions in a little town of Asia, with the mutual purpose of securing the possession of a portion of Africa. But it is still more extraordinary that the persons who directed the efforts of each party were both of the same nation, of the same age, of the same rank, of the same corps, and of the same school. Philippot, to whose talents the English and the Turks owed the preservation of St. Jean d'Acre, had been the companion of Napoleon at the military school of Paris. They had been there examined together, previous to their being sent to their respective corps. "His figure resembled yours," said the Emperor to me, after having dictated his eulogium in the memoirs and mentioned all the ill he had done him. "Sire," I answered, "there were many other points of affinity between us. We had been intimate and inseparable companions at the military school. When he passed through London with Sir Sidney Smith, who by his assistance had been enabled to escape from the Temple, he sought for me in every direction. I called at his lodgings only half an hour after he had gone. Had it not been for this accident, I should probably have accompanied him. I was at that time without occupation. The prospect of adventure might have tempted me, and how strangely might the course of my destinies have been turned into a new direction." "I am well aware," said Napoleon, "of the influence which chance usurps over our political determinations, and it is the knowledge of that circumstance which has always kept me free from prejudice, and rendered me very indulgent with regard to the party adopted by individuals in our political convulsions. To be a good Frenchman, or to wish to become so, was all that I look for in anyone." The Emperor then went on to compare the confusion of our troubles to battles in the night time, where each man attacks his neighbour, and friends are often confounded with foes. But when daylight returns, and order is restored, everyone forgives the injury which he has sustained through mistake. "Even for myself," said he, "how could I undertake to say that there might not have existed circumstances sufficiently powerful, notwithstanding my natural sentiments, to induce me to emigrate? The vicinity of the frontier, for instance, a friendly attachment, or the influence of a chief. In revolutions, we can only speak with certainty to what we have done. It is silly to affirm that we could not have acted otherwise." The Emperor then related a singular example of the influence of chance over the destinies of men. Serrurier and the younger Hédouville, while travelling together on foot to emigrate to Spain, were met by a military patrol. Hédouville, being the younger and more active of the two, cleared the frontier, thought himself very lucky, and went to spend a life of mere vegetation in Spain. Serrurier, on the contrary, being obliged to return into the interior, bewailed his unhappy fate and became a marshal. Such is the uncertainty of human foresight and calculations. At Saint-Jean-d'Acre, the general-in-chief lost Caffarelli, of whom he was extremely fond. Caffarelli entertained a sort of reverential respect for the general-in-chief. The influence of this sentiment was so great that though he was delirious for several days previous to his death when Napoleon went to see him, the announcement of his name seemed to recall him to life. He became more collected, his spirits revived, and he conversed coherently, but he relapsed into his former state immediately after Napoleon's departure. This singular phenomenon was renewed every time the general-in-chief paid him a visit. Napoleon received, during the siege of Saint-Jean-d'Acre, an affecting proof of heroic devotedness. While he was in the trenches, a shell fell at his feet. 2 grenadiers who observed it immediately rushed towards him, placed him between them, and raising their arms above his head, completely covered every part of his body. Happily, the shell respected the whole group. Nobody was injured. One of these brave grenadiers afterwards became General Dumesnil, who lost a leg in the campaign of Moscow and commanded the fortress of Vincennes at the time of the invasion in 1815. The capital had been for some weeks occupied by the Allies, and Dumesnil still held out. Nothing was then talked of in Paris but his obstinate defence and his humorous reply when summoned by the Russians to surrender: "Give me back my leg, and I will give up my fortress." The French soldiers acquired extraordinary reputation in Egypt, and not without cause. They had dispersed and dismayed the celebrated Mamelukes, the most formidable militia of the East. After the retreat from Syria, a Turkish army landed at Aboukir. Murat Bey, the most powerful and brave of the Mamelukes, left Upper Egypt whither he had fled for safety, and reached the Turkish camp by a circuitous route. On the landing of the Turks, the French detachments had fallen back in order to concentrate their forces. The Pacha who commanded the Turks was delighted at this movement, which he mistook for the effect of fear, and on perceiving Murat Bey, he exultingly exclaimed, "So, these are the terrible French whom you dare not face. See, the moment I make my appearance, how they fly before me." The indignant Murat Bey furiously replied, "Pacha, render thanks to the Prophet that it has pleased these Frenchmen to retire. If they should return, you will disappear before them like dust before the wind." This prophecy was fulfilled. Some days after, the French poured down upon the Turkish army and put it to flight. Murat Bey, who had interviews with several of our generals, could not recover from his surprise at their diminutive stature and pitiful condition. The Oriental nations attach high importance to the formation of the body, and they were unable to conceive how so much genius could exist within such small dimensions. The appearance of Kleber alone came up to their ideas. He was an uncommonly fine-looking man, but his manners were extremely offensive. The discrimination of the Egyptians induced them to think that he was not a Frenchman. In fact, though a native of Alsace, Kleber had spent the early part of his life in the Prussian army, and might very well have passed for a German. Someone here observed that he had been a janissary in his youth, on which the emperor burst into a fit of laughter and said somebody had been hoaxing him. The Grand Marshal told the emperor that at the Battle of Aboukir he was for the first time placed in his army and near his person. He was then so little accustomed to the boldness of his manoeuvres that he scarcely understood any of the orders he heard him give. "Particularly, sire," added he, "when I heard you call out to an officer of the guards, 'Hercule, take 25 men and charge that rabble,' I really thought I had lost my senses. Your Majesty pointed at the time to a detachment of perhaps 1,000 Turkish horse." After all, the losses sustained by the army in Egypt were far from being so considerable as might have been expected in a country to which the troops were unaccustomed, particularly when the insalubrity of the climate, the remoteness of the resources of the country, the ravages of the plague, and the numerous actions which have immortalized that army are taken into account. The French force, at its landing in Egypt, amounted to 30,000 men. It was augmented by the wrecks of the Battle of Aboukir and probably also by some partial arrivals from France, and yet the total loss sustained by the army, from the commencement of the campaign to 2 months after the departure of the General-in-Chief for Europe, that is to say, during the space of 7 or 8 and 20 months, amounted only to 8,915, as is proved by the official report of the Mustermaster General of the army. Killed in battle, 3,614. Died of their wounds, 824. Died through various accidents, 200 died from common disorders, 2,458 died from the pestilential fever, 1,699. Total 8,915. The life of a man must indeed be replete with prodigies, when one of his acts, which is without parallel in history, scarcely arrests our attention. When Caesar passed the Rubicon, he possessed an army and was advancing towards his defending forces. When Alexander, urged by the ardor of youth and the fire of genius, landed in Asia to make war on the great king, he, Alexander, was the son of a king himself, and courted the chances of ambition and glory at the head of the forces of his kingdom. But that a private individual, whose name 3 years before was unknown to the world, who at that moment had nothing to aid him but the reputation of a few victories, his name, and the consciousness of his genius, should have dared to conceive the project of taking into his own hands the destinies of 30 millions of men, of protecting them from external defeats and internal dissensions, that roused by the recital of the troubles which were described to him, and by the idea of the disasters which he foresaw, he should have exclaimed, "France will be lost through these fine talkers, these babblers. Now is the time to save her." That he should have abandoned his army and crossed the seas, at the risk of his liberty and reputation, have reached the French soil and flown to the capital, that he should there have seized the helm and stopped short a nation intoxicated with every excess, that he should have suddenly brought her back to the true course of reason and justice, that he should from that moment have prepared for himself a mould of power and glory till then unknown, and that all this should have been accomplished without the shedding of a single tear or a drop of blood, such an undertaking may be regarded as one of the most gigantic and sublime that ever was heard of. It will fill calm and dispassionate posterity with astonishment and admiration, though at the present day it may be qualified with the title of a desperate flight and an infamous desertion. The army, however, which Napoleon left behind him, continued to occupy Egypt for the space of 2 years longer. It was the opinion of the emperor that it ought never to have been forced unwillingly to remain there, and the Grand Marshal, who accompanied the army to the last moment, concurred in that opinion. After the departure of the General-in-Chief, Kleber, who succeeded him, deceived and misled by intrigues, treated for the evacuation of Egypt,